I want to invite Yashvanth. That's how I pronounce his name? Yeah. Yashvanth from Silence Laboratories. Silence Laboratories are a great partner of ours. They're also co-hosting this event. And he's going to talk about threshold ECDSA with Identifiable Abort. Yep. So give it for Yashvanth.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm Yash. I'll be speaking about my work on threshold ECDSA with Identifiable Abort, and I'll be making the case that the honest majority setting is an interesting one to look at. This is joint work with Divya Ravi at the University of Amsterdam. Okay, so just as a quick recap, we're going to be looking at threshold signing, which is a scenario in which Bob, who has all of this Bitcoin on his laptop, which is secured with some signing key, decides to sort of decentralize the management of his key. In particular, he takes his key, he splits it into many parts, and he stores each part on a different device so that when he wants to actually sign a message, these devices have to run some sort of interactive protocol to produce a signature. And the idea behind this is to distribute the risk in managing this key. In particular, an attacker will need to compromise multiple devices before it gets anything useful about Bob's key. So a quick overview of this talk. If you take nothing else away, this slide sort of gives what's interesting to take away from this. I'll quickly go over the setting that we work in this talk. I'll talk about Identifiable Abort, what it is, why it's interesting, and how we can actually achieve it. And I'll particularly focus on broadcasts for Identifiable Abort. And I'll spend a relatively small amount of time talking about the ECDSA protocol itself. Most of this talk is going to be focused on sort of the network assumption and not so much on the concrete ECDSA signing protocol, but I'll touch upon it briefly. As a running example for this setting, I'm going to be looking at sort of a network of nodes managing key shares. And I'm interested in Identifiable Abort in this talk, specifically in the context of mitigating denial of service attacks. And of course, I'll get into how this works and why. And I'll give a quick overview of what the anatomy of an ECDSA protocol that works in this setting looks like. And what I'll really be diving into is what broadcast looks like in this setting, why it's important, and what it achieves. Right, so given that a lot of existing works, and as far as I know, most works in this area, assume some sort of broadcast channel, which can be pretty expensive to instantiate, I'll define a slightly weaker notion of broadcast that I'll argue is good enough. And I'll show that you can't really achieve this in the dishonest majority setting, that's t less than n. And in the t less than n by 2 setting, which is the honest majority, it's fairly simple to achieve this intermediate notion of broadcast. And finally, there's a clean honest majority protocol for ECDSA signing, which I'll just give a short overview of. And come ask me after the talk if you're interested. Right, so in a nutshell, the case for the honest majority setting to study ECDSA signing is the following. Broadly, especially in the sort of network of nodes type of scenario, there is a global honest majority anyway, because you need sort of extra redundant parties to help you recover the key if it were to be lost. And honest majority, as we show in this talk, is sort of necessary for a fundamental building block to get Identifiable Abort anyway, especially when we want to use point-to-point channels only. And finally, ECDSA signing, which is usually somewhat painful because you have to use some kind of cryptographic machinery in the dishonest majority setting, becomes pretty straightforward in the honest majority case, because secure multiplication in particular is fairly straightforward if you have an honest majority. So you don't need tools like OT or PyA or whatever other thing. All right, so this is a running example. There's a network of nodes that Bob from earlier is using to manage his secret key. There's a different fragment of the secret key on each node. And to make things a little more concrete, let's say we look at 3 out of n signing. I mean, n is 5 here, but what 3 out of n means is that any set of 3 nodes can get together to sign a message. Cool. So if you think about it for a second, you'll realize that the best possible security that you can achieve is security against 2 corruptions, and in particular, 2 corruptions out of 5. And this is why I say that there's a sort of global honest majority, in that if there are 2 corruptions, you can assume that 2-party states are completely irretrievable in the worst case, and so there must be at least 3 overall, that is another 2 honest parties, who will help you reconstruct the signing key. So you need at least 5 parties to make sure that the signing key isn't lost. Right, and while it is the case that there is usually a global honest majority, what's common to do in practice is that you keep 2 of these nodes offline just to help with key recovery if such a situation might arise. And when you actually want to sign messages, you run some sort of dishonest majority protocol with just the 3 parties that are necessary to reconstruct the key. I mean, you don't actually reconstruct the key, but you run a signing protocol between these 3 parties. And in particular, you use a dishonest majority protocol that achieves malicious security, in that if any of these nodes, or rather even 2 out of these 3 nodes, if they were to send malformed messages, the secret key still stays safe. But in the event of a failure that some of these nodes send malformed messages, the MPC fails. And while the secret key is still safe, there isn't a signature that's output by the protocol. So this is what I'll be calling a denial of service in this context. And broadly in the MPC literature, this is called the security of the bot model. The folklore remedy, or rather one of the folklore remedies for this type of situation, is to consider this stronger notion of identifiable abort. So what does that mean? Let's consider this situation where this node on the right is corrupt and sends some sort of malformed message. A protocol that achieves identifiable abort lets you figure out exactly who sent this message, and in particular lets you prove to other people that this is the party that deviated from the protocol. And so once you identified who caused the problem, you can bring up your global honest majority from earlier, rotate out the nodes so that the misbehaving node is kicked out, and you can do whatever you want with this one bad node. Now that we figured out who was cheating, we can maybe slash them and remove their stake or penalize them or whatever other way is appropriate. And that's it. Once we've thrown out the misbehaving node, ideally signing should proceed as normal and we should get our signatures again. So we're back to the mode where we're receiving output. So in principle, you could always use out-of-band methods to figure out who caused a problem. Right? And this arguably is enough for many scenarios where, for instance, if there's an institution that's controlling all of the nodes itself and it has the ability to debug what happened, what went wrong in a protocol by like examining all the nodes and so forth, maybe an out-of-band method is perfectly fine. But what we want, or what we're interested in this talk, especially in the sort of network where we can't really rely on everyone getting together to debug and so forth, we want a certifiable mechanism within the protocol itself that figures out who caused the protocol. Sorry, that caused who crashed the protocol. And in a little more detail, we want to specify that every party either gets output, or if a party doesn't have output, it has an explanation as to why it doesn't have an output. In particular, it has the identity of someone who caused a crash, in addition along with some sort of certificate that says this is the person who caused the crash, and you can't, of course, you can't falsely accuse an honest party that actually followed the protocol. Very broadly, most protocols have 2 ways in which they could be crashed, and 2 ways in which you could induce a crash. One is to send a malformed protocol message that's deviating from the protocol specification, or you could more simply just send no message at all. Right? If you're just quiet through the protocol, observe that for instance, in the 3-party setting or in the 3-party signing setting, you really need all 3 parties to participate in the protocol, especially if you want if you want security against all but one corruptions, you need everyone to speak in the protocol. So just by not speaking, you can crash the protocol, and there's no way to get a signature out. Right, so with those very broad attack strategies in mind, let's figure out how we can mitigate these kinds of denial of service attacks. So usually we can start with some sort of baseline security with the bot protocol for threshold ECDSA signing. And under the security of the bot protocol, we can include some sort of mechanism that guarantees that every party says something in each round. Right? So this rules out not saying anything. So the form of denial of service where you just simply refuse to speak is ruled out by this mechanism. And on top of this, we want some mechanism to guarantee that conditioned on sending a message, all of your messages are well-formed. So this rules out the other form of denial of service where you send bad messages. So yeah, I mean, this on quick inspection, this seems to solve the problem that there's a baseline protocol that is secure against every form of attack except denial of service. And both forms of denial of service have some mechanism that handle it. You're forced to speak and you're forced to send good messages. And Right, so for the upper mechanism, that's to make sure that every message is well formed. There are standard mitigation techniques, just a couple of them. The canonical one goes all the way back to GMW, which is basically every party preemptively proves in zero knowledge that all of the messages that it's sending are well formed. That there are well-defined statements for every message, for like the next message function of the protocol, and every party just proves that they're following the next message function. It's of course really expensive to instantiate this generically, but there have been tailored ways to do this for ECDSA sending. For instance, there's this work of Canetti et al. From a few years ago, and also the talk from earlier today. Yeah, this is doable. And right, so this second thing is arguably, or to some extent, somewhat ignored. In particular, how do we actually make sure that people speak when they're supposed to speak, right? So a standard way to kind of work around this is to run all messages or to send all messages over a broadcast channel. So by default, all parties are obliged to broadcast any message that they were supposed to send. You can instantiate private channels over broadcast by, let's say, encrypting to a public key or something, but ultimately, every message is passed through some sort of secure broadcast channel. And yeah, this is annoying because this gives you external trust assumptions, because of course, broadcast is quite painful to construct yourself. So maybe you outsource to some sort of third-party service, which is, there could be some sort of latency in using the service. It could also be expensive in terms of gas and so forth. Alternatively, you could have maybe like one designated node that acts as a coordinator and that de facto implements a broadcast channel, but then that's another assumption because a coordinator is also a single point of failure as far as broadcast goes. So ideally, we want to avoid secure broadcast. So I know that the term broadcast tends to get thrown around a lot, and I want to be more specific about what it means. I'm talking about secure broadcast channels where everyone is guaranteed to get a consistent message, and every honest party gets the same message. So it's easy to see why this works, because if all protocol messages are over a broadcast channel and if let's say P0, party P0 doesn't send a message on the broadcast channel when it's supposed to, then we know that P0 is the one who's cheating because it's been quiet when it was obliged to send a message on the broadcast channel. So that's kind of why broadcast works, but it is a somewhat expensive tool to use that we'd like to avoid. And the rest of the talk, we're going to be predicated on wanting to avoid a generic broadcast channel. So for this work, we defined a sort of weaker notion called broadcast IA. It's more of a placeholder name. It's nothing too glamorous, but it's just what sort of works for this particular setting. We show that it's impossible to achieve with a dishonest majority over point-to-point channels only. This is more of a sanity check than anything. And we also give a simple honest majority protocol that does achieve this notion in just 2 rounds. It's nothing like groundbreaking, but it is useful to have this for this. Useful to have this particular notion for this setting. For the baseline security with the abort protocol, we borrow an idea from this DKLS paper. It's not the main protocol from the DKLS paper, which is dishonest majority. There's like a section at the end that sketches an honest majority protocol that we kind of flesh out. And finally, for the mechanism to guarantee that every message is well formed, this is also pretty straightforward, because recall that the difficulty with computing ECDSA in a distributed way is doing secure multiplications, which in the honest majority setting is pretty straightforward. And naturally, this extends to also verifying that the multiplications are done correctly. In particular, there's a simple Schnorr-like zero-knowledge proof that just proves that you follow the protocol honestly. And also, there's like these standard techniques from verifiable secret sharing that you can use to sort of prove that somebody had sent you a malformed message, like that somebody didn't send you what you were expecting. Concretely, it's sort of this, you didn't get the right point on the polynomial or something like this. Again, the details aren't super important for this talk. Right, so let's talk about broadcast and identifiable abort. The most basic guarantee that you can expect from broadcast is consistency. In particular, we want that a malicious sender can't trick 2 different honest receivers into accepting conflicting messages M and M prime. And that's the most basic thing. And in the security with abort setting, that's in the sort of denial of service susceptible setting, this is pretty trivial to achieve. There's this paper by Goldwasser and Lindell that makes this explicit in that you can just echo messages across different parties when you receive them. Our work is going to be kind of based on this. So what we want in the identifiable abort setting is that if the sender cheats, every honest party obtains a certificate of cheating, that it's able to prove to any sort of third party that the sender in this broadcast protocol didn't actually follow the protocol specification. So in the event that the sender attempts to violate consistency, that's if the sender tries to convince two different honest parties to accept different messages, you get a certificate of cheating that are called capital omega. And if the sender sends nothing, that's if the sender stays quiet when they were obliged to send a message, what the honest parties get is some certificate of non-responsiveness. I call that little omega. And I want to highlight here that these are two different things, or like we make a distinction between actively deviating from the protocol and not sending a message when you were supposed to, because an active deviation is a definite corruption, and you probably want to penalize this heavily. Like this is a hacked node that's deviating. As opposed to not sending a message when you're supposed to, which could just be because the network has failed you, or you've been cut off from the network briefly or something like this. So we don't want as heavy a penalty for parties that just don't speak when they're supposed to. But again, at the level of this protocol, or for the scope of this work, all we care about is distinguishing between these two aborts, like some sort of higher level protocol logic can decide what to do with this information. All right, so as a quick sanity check, is this notion of broadcast achievable with a dishonest majority? Right? It's pretty easy to see that it's, or rather we show that it's not. So consider a standard three-party scenario where there are two parties that are corrupt. I claim that there's always going to be an attack in which the two colluding nodes can frame P0. And in particular, they're going to be able to prove that P0 is corrupt even though it's not. In order to see why, just consider an alternative execution of the protocol where it's in fact P0 that's corrupt. Right? So being corrupt, P0 can just refuse to participate in the protocol and not send any messages. And by this certifiability notion, what the honest node should get is a certificate little omega that proves that P0 was in fact offline when it was supposed to have been online. So given that that mechanism exists, let's come back to our actual scenario. P1 and P2 could collude to effectively cut off P0 from the network. They could just pretend that P0 was offline. And given this, they can use the same mechanism that I had mentioned earlier to produce a certificate that says that P0 is offline. These two scenarios are basically indistinguishable except for the fact that P0 in this case is actually honest. And these two nodes have managed to produce a bad certificate against or rather a verifying certificate against an honest party. Right, so that shows that it's impossible. Now, let's look at what's possible, or let's see what's feasible with an honest majority. Right, so remember that we have this we were assuming a global honest majority for making sure that the key is still safe and so forth. And I suggest that we can use this proactively, the fact that there is a global honest majority. Concretely, if you have these 5 parties with their corresponding public keys, I assume a public key infrastructure, and we assume that, let's say, P0 wants to broadcast a message M. The protocol proceeds in just 2 rounds. It's just a small tweak of the Goldwasser-Lindell protocol. The first round, P0 signs the message that it wants to send and sends it to all parties. In the second round, every party PI does one of 2 things. If it received a valid signed message from P0 in the first round, it just forwards this message to everyone else. If it received anything except that, that's either received a message that wasn't signed or P0 just didn't send anything to PI when it was supposed to, it signs a message saying bot and forwards it to all the other PJ values, all the other PJs. So basically, after the second round, we can think about what to output, right? So what each PI does is it sees if it's possible to assemble a certificate of cheating. Again, there are 2 options. One is if the dealer P0 was trying to violate consistency, it would have sent two different messages, M and M star, to 2 different honest parties, and that gets caught in the second round during the echo. Right, so that gives a pretty straightforward certificate of cheating. And for a certificate of which to my knowledge this is the first time we're looking at, if if PI sees at least 3 signed messages saying I received nothing from the sender in the second round, then this is enough to certify that the sender P0 actually did not send enough messages or did not follow the protocol honestly. So that's the certificate of cheating and the certificate of non-responsiveness. In both cases, it's just a bunch of signed messages. And of course, if neither of these certificates are found, I'll show in the analysis that it's safe to output whatever message has already been received. This is for each PI. As a quick note on the analysis, so as a sanity check, we can see that an honest P0, that's an honest sender, will never be blamed with any sort of certificate of cheating. There's no capital omega because there's no conflicting pair of messages that the honest sender is going to send. And there's no little omega, that's the certificate of being offline, because you need at least three signatures to certify that somebody was offline. And because there are at most 2 corrupt parties, P0 followed the protocol, nobody is going to be able to produce 3 signatures saying that P0 was offline, because there aren't enough colluding bad parties. And in the case that the sender P0 is actually corrupt, if any honest parties receive conflicting messages, that yields a certificate of cheating. That's pretty straightforward. And if P0 is quiet, that it sends no messages to any honest parties, then that certainly results in a certificate of non-responsiveness. So conditioned on, given these 2 facts, what we can establish is that there must be at least some honest party that receives something, right? And like one step further, we can look at this and say that every honest party either gets one of the 2 bad certificates, which is straightforward, or if it outputs something, it will be consistent, because any inconsistent message will be caught. And there's no scenario where you output nothing as an honest party, because in the worst case, you'll always get the certificate of non-responsiveness. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of breezing through it, but really it's a pretty simple analysis if you're looking at it like written down. Yeah, and a couple of notes on this, because this is, of course, not the end goal. This is going to be used in a higher level protocol. Every broadcast message is going to be accompanied by a signature on it. So if you want to blame a sender for sending a bad message later on, you can always use this. But just because you're able to produce a message along with the signature from someone doesn't prove that anyone else got the same thing. Because the other party, because if the sender is corrupt, it can arbitrarily sign messages after the fact. So it does not, in particular, it does not establish agreement. It does not establish consensus, which is why we circumvent a whole bunch of impossibilities. But it can prove that somebody sent you a bad message. All right, so a quick note on how to build an ECDSA protocol out of this. We took this, there's a pretty straightforward way to get ECDSA signing in the honest majority setting if all you want is security of the bot. That comes from this DKLS paper. Intuitively, it's just one broadcast round on top of verifiable secret sharing and distributed key generation. In this work, we just take the baseline thing and we add that layer that I talked about. So underneath the broadcast, the layer underneath is the broadcast that I just mentioned, and the layer above that is the message consistency. So the layer below this ensures that everyone sends something. Then we use the ECDSA protocol itself as the baseline, and then the layer on top makes sure that every message sent by everyone is consistent. So that's the NISIC and the Identifiable Abort component that I mentioned. Yeah, so just to sort of breeze through it really quickly, these protocols are based on the standard class of like Feldman and Peterson type of verifiable secret sharing and distributed key generation. Intuitively, in a successful execution of the verifiable secret sharing, we will all get secret shares of some Peterson committed value. And the only way that this protocol can fail is if a dealer sends a bad ciphertext, which we have a mechanism can be caught pretty easily in that you can just open up whatever ciphertext you received that was badly formed. And you can build, given this VSS as a black box, you can build distributed key generation, which just unmasks the Peterson commitment, like prices apart the secret and the message from the Peterson commitment that was sampled in the VSS. Yeah, that's super high level. I didn't really go into it because this isn't where, or this isn't really worth focusing on for this talk. All I want to say is that overall we get with 3 broadcast IA rounds, so 3 rounds over broadcast, where broadcast is instantiated, as I mentioned earlier, and no like cryptographic machinery in terms of PIA or OTA or anything. We get a threshold ECDSA protocol in the honest majority setting that also achieves identifiable abort. And importantly, runs only over point-to-point channels. Right, so in conclusion, dishonest majority protocols are in a lot of ways inherently susceptible to denial of service. And while you can get around this by making external assumptions, it's also worth thinking about how you can keep the assumptions contained to within the system. So no external broadcast or anything like this. Yeah, so we define this notion of broadcast that seems to be kind of tight for identifiable abort. In particular, you're able to catch parties that are silent, that don't speak when they're supposed to. We show that this notion is provably impossible to achieve with a dishonest majority. And we give a simple construction over point-to-point channels when there's an honest majority available, which I argue is a reasonable assumption in many scenarios. So starting with verifiable secret sharing built on this broadcast, we build DKG, and then finally ECDSA signing itself. And all of this is pretty simple in the honest majority setting. It gets around a lot of other issues. And yeah, we're still in the process of implementing this. We estimate that it's a few orders of magnitude lighter than signing with a dishonest majority, which is generally falls in line with our understanding of how honest majority versus dishonest majority works in MPC. And stay tuned for benchmarks and our full paper. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Yash. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. Go ahead.
Shall I just go ahead? Yeah. I wanted to ask, where is this used? In what context is this relevant?
Like ECDSA signing or like
The honest majority.
Yeah. So if you have, for instance, this network of nodes, and assume for a moment that you don't back up your signing key anywhere else, you really rely on this network to keep track of your key, right? I mean, of course, this assumption is not always true, but like assume that you really don't want to bring up any cold storage where the key is stored in a single place, right? So the network should have should have enough shares of the key to reconstruct the key if you want it, right? Because of these 5 nodes that I showed, for instance, and if you have 2 parties that are corrupt, right? That's it. Like you cannot have access to these shares of the key anymore. So, or whatever, 3 parties. If you have 3 parties signing, of which you want security to 2 corruptions, you cannot assume that you'll get these 2 shares of the key if you want, like when you want it. So you need to have enough redundancy with these extra parties to recover the key when you actually want.
I think it's just assuming, not assuming an adversary, but just redundancy, right? I think that's a generalized use case.
Yeah, I guess it's adversarial redundancy against adversarial attacks. Yeah. But yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm curious. Have you considered whether there will be any difference if the only thing you need is identifiable abort for signature aggregator?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. What about the signature aggregator?
Are there any sort of implications or relaxing of this honest majority thing if the only thing that you need is identifiable abort for signature aggregator? That if there is an omission or commission fault, you just need to detect it when the signature aggregator.
Yeah, I mean, then you had to trust the signature aggregator. I mean, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're proposing a model where there's a signature aggregator that receives everything and is responsible for the output, right? So imagine that there's some party who's supposed to send a message to the signature aggregator for it to finish its job. Now the signature aggregator can say, that party didn't send me the message, even though it did, and like blame that party, right? So you're sort of making this assumption that you trust whatever the signature aggregator says in terms of who's speaking to it. So that model is used, but and it makes things easier if you're willing to assume that you can trust the signature aggregator. But for the sake of,
I understand what you're saying. That the last paragraph of identifiable abort section of it legal 22 does this
Yeah.
coordinator
Exactly.
thing. But like signature aggregator here could just be any other party. Like it need not be an external entity, but you only need to detect an identifiable abort in the aggregation phase, not in like round 2 to round 3.
Oh, okay. So I think I understand your question. It's that let's say you have a 3-round protocol. Can you detect, and you're okay with the first 2 rounds, and then the last round you want to detect who sent you a bad share? Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a subset of this. And your question is, does it become easier? I think that the last round message also kind of depends on protocol context. So at least for ECDSA signing, I don't think it becomes easier.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Yash.